As you watch this video, kindly like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that whenever I post a new video, you'll be the first person to be notified. Richard Khumalo was born in a small village in South Africa where poverty was not just a condition, it was a way of life. His father, Jabulani, was a struggling farmer who worked tirelessly under the scorching sun, planting maize and vegetables on a tiny piece of land that barely produced enough to feed the family. His mother, Nansa, had died when he was just 6 years old, leaving Richard and his younger sister, Thandi, under their father's care. Richard grew up knowing struggle. His family's home was a small, crumbling mud house with a leaking roof. He walked 5 miles to school every day, often barefoot because there was no money for shoes. The other children in the village faced similar hardships, but Richard was different. He was determined to escape. Every evening, after helping his father on the farm, he would sit under the dim glow of a candle and study. His father always told him, "Education is your only ticket out of this life, my son." And Richard believed him. He dreamed of leaving the village, of one day becoming a successful businessman, of lifting Thandi out of poverty and giving her a better life. One evening, his father came home looking weak and pale. He sat down heavily on the wooden stool and clutched his chest. "Baba, what's wrong?" Richard asked, rushing to his side. "I just need rest," his father whispered. But rest did not help. Days turned into weeks, and his condition worsened. The local clinic was miles away, and even if they could reach it, they had no money for proper medical care. Richard watched helplessly as his father grew weaker until, one cold morning, Jabulani Khumalo took his last breath. Richard and Thandi were now orphans. With no one to provide for them, survival became a daily battle. The farm was failing, and food was scarce. Some villagers offered small jobs, fetching water, cutting firewood, but it was never enough. A group of men from the city arrived in their village, looking to buy land for commercial development. They offered money, more money than Richard had ever seen in his life, for the small farmland that his father had left behind. The land was their last connection to their father, their only inheritance. But Richard knew that if they stayed, they would starve. He made the hardest decision of his life. He sold the land. With the money, he bought a one-way ticket to America, leaving Thandi in the care of a trusted elderly neighbor. Before leaving, he held his sister close and made her a promise. "I will come back for you, Thandi. One day, I will make enough money to give you a better life." Then, with nothing but a small bag and the fire of determination burning in his heart, Richard boarded the plane to America. When Richard arrived in New York City, he was overwhelmed. The bright lights, towering skyscrapers, and busy streets were nothing like the quiet village he had left behind. He barely spoke English fluently, had no family, and had only $200 in his pocket. With nowhere to stay, he spent his first few nights sleeping in a homeless shelter. During the day, he walked the streets looking for work, knocking on doors and asking for any job. But nobody wanted to hire a foreigner with no experience. Desperation forced him to take whatever he could find. His first job was washing dishes in a small restaurant. It was exhausting, long hours, little pay, and harsh treatment from the managers. But he endured it. From dishwashing, he moved to cleaning office buildings at night. Then, he took a construction job carrying heavy cement bags under the hot sun. He worked 3 jobs at once, sleeping only 4 hours a night, saving every dollar he could. Still, there were days when he went hungry. Nights when he asked himself if he had made a mistake. But every time he wanted to give up, he thought of Thandi back home. He had made a promise, and he would not break it. Then one day, an opportunity came. While cleaning an office late at night, he overheard 2 businessmen talking about real estate. They spoke about buying cheap properties, fixing them up, and selling them for profit. Richard listened closely, taking mental notes. That night, he made a decision. Real estate would be his way out. He started reading books, studying business, and learning everything he could about the industry. He saved enough money to buy a cheap, rundown house in a struggling neighborhood. It was a risk. If it failed, he would lose everything. But it didn't fail. Richard worked day and night, fixing the house himself to save money. When he sold it, he made double the investment. With that profit, he bought another property, then another, and another. Within a few years, he had built a real estate empire. The boy who once had nothing was now a self-made millionaire. He moved into a luxurious penthouse in Los Angeles, drove expensive cars, and owned hotels, restaurants, and luxury properties across the country. But even with all his success, he never forgot where he came from. He regularly sent money home to Thandi and planned to bring her to America soon. It seemed like life had finally rewarded him for his struggles. But what Richard didn't know was that his biggest test was yet to come. A test that would nearly destroy everything he had built. And it would come from the one person he trusted the most. Richard Carter had built an empire from nothing. His name was respected in the real estate industry, and his business ventures stretched from Los Angeles to Miami. His life was one of power, luxury, and success. But even with all his wealth, he still longed for something deeper, a family. That's when he met Lisa Morgan. Lisa was stunning. She had the kind of beauty that turned heads the moment she walked into a room. But it wasn't just her looks that captivated Richard. It was her charm, her intelligence, and the way she made him feel like the only man in the world. They met at a charity gala in Beverly Hills, an event filled with the wealthiest and most influential people in America. Lisa was working in corporate finance, handling high-end investments. She was ambitious, driven, and seemed to understand the struggles of success. For the first time in years, Richard let his guard down. Their love story moved fast. Lavish dates, luxurious vacations, and candlelit dinners at his penthouse overlooking the city. Lisa was everything he thought he needed, a strong, confident woman who stood by his side. A year after they met, Richard proposed. The wedding was a grand event, attended by celebrities, politicians, and business moguls. The media called them the power couple of real estate and finance. To the world, they were perfect. But Lisa had secrets. She was never truly in love with Richard. She was in love with his wealth. From the moment she met him, she had seen him as a stepping stone, a golden ticket to a life of luxury. She smiled in public, played the role of the loving wife, but behind closed doors, her heart belonged to someone else. His name was Jason Reynolds. Jason was young, flashy, and reckless. He had no job, no ambition, just good looks and a dangerous charm. He and Lisa had been lovers long before she met Richard, but Jason had nothing to offer her financially. So she played a long game, marrying Richard while secretly keeping Jason in her life. She told herself she would wait for the right moment. That moment came when tragedy struck. One evening, Richard was driving home from a late business meeting. It had been a long day, and he was exhausted. His mind was on his upcoming trip to South Africa. He was finally going to bring Thandi to America. But fate had other plans. As he drove through an intersection, a speeding car ran a red light and crashed into him at full speed. The impact was devastating. His car spun out of control, flipped over twice, and crashed into a ditch. By the time paramedics arrived, he was barely alive. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save him. Though he survived, he slipped into a coma. When Lisa received the news, she acted devastated. She cried in front of the cameras, held Richard's hand at the hospital, and gave emotional interviews about how much she loved her husband. But behind closed doors, she was celebrating. To her, Richard's accident was an opportunity. If he never woke up, she would inherit everything. And she didn't intend to wait. Within weeks, Lisa started making moves. She forged Richard's signature and sold some of his most valuable properties. She withdrew millions from his accounts, transferring the money into offshore accounts under her name. Then, without warning, she disappeared. She moved to Miami with Jason, buying a luxury penthouse overlooking the ocean. They threw wild parties, spent recklessly, and enjoyed the fortune she had stolen. Lisa thought she had won. She believed Richard would never wake up. But she was wrong. 2 months later, Richard's eyes slowly opened. At first, everything was a blur. His body was weak, his mind foggy. He struggled to remember what had happened, but as the days passed, the memories returned. The accident. The pain. The last thing he remembered was driving home that night. His best friend, Marcus, was by his side. "Where's Lisa?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Marcus hesitated. "She's gone, Rich." Richard frowned. "Gone where?" Marcus took a deep breath and handed him a folder filled with documents, bank statements, and photographs. "Lisa sold your properties. She emptied your accounts. She ran off with another man." Richard's world stopped. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with had betrayed him in the worst way possible. He opened the folder with trembling hands. The evidence was all there: Lisa and Jason living lavishly in Miami, partying with his money, spending what he had worked so hard for. His pain turned into something dark. Rage. Lisa thought he was dead. But she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because Richard Carter was alive. And he was coming for her. Richard's eyes burned with fury as he read through the photos and bank statements. His hands trembled not from weakness, but from the seething rage that grew within him. He had spent years building his empire. He had given Lisa everything: love, trust, security. And in return, she had sold him out for her own selfish desires. It took everything within him not to break down in front of Marcus. Instead, he took a deep breath, closed the folder, and leaned back in his hospital bed, his thoughts racing. "Richard, we need to go after her," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We can't let her get away with this. You've worked too hard for all of this." Richard nodded. "I'll find her. I don't care what it takes." Richard wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. He had faced hardships his entire life and had always risen above them. But this betrayal, this heartbreak, felt different. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice. Within days of waking up, Richard hired a team of private investigators. They scoured Lisa's past, traced her movements, and dug into her network of friends, business associates, and contacts. The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Lisa had planned this for months. She had been setting the stage for her escape long before Richard's accident. She had slowly siphoned money from his accounts, transferred properties into her name, and meticulously erased any trace of her involvement in the fraudulent transactions. But the investigators were relentless. They uncovered a paper trail of forged signatures, illegal bank transfers, and even pictures of Lisa and Jason laughing on private yachts in the Mediterranean. The evidence against them was damning. "Where is she now?" Richard asked one of the lead investigators, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "She's in Miami," the investigator said. "We've tracked her to a luxury penthouse in South Beach. We're certain she's living there with Jason." Richard's heart skipped a beat. Miami. It was a city of dreams for some, but to him, it felt like the place where his nightmare had just begun. Richard didn't waste time. With Marcus at his side, he boarded the next flight to Miami. As the plane descended toward the runway, Richard's mind was racing. He could picture Lisa's face, the woman who had promised to stand by him forever. He could hear her sweet words, her empty promises. They arrived at the penthouse address, a towering glass structure that reflected the golden glow of the setting sun. Richard's stomach tightened as they stepped into the elevator. "Stay calm, Rich," Marcus said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We have everything we need. She won't get away with this." The elevator doors opened to a pristine lobby with marble floors and expensive art pieces. Richard and Marcus walked past the front desk, where a security guard barely looked up. They had done their homework. The penthouse was under Lisa's name. When they reached the door, Richard hesitated. This moment, this confrontation, had been building up for weeks. He had imagined what he would say, how he would make Lisa pay for her treachery. But now that he was here, it felt surreal. Marcus knocked firmly. There was a brief silence before the door opened. Lisa stood in front of them, her face dropping when she saw Richard. She tried to mask it with a smile, but the panic in her eyes was clear. "Richard?" Her voice trembled, and for a second, Richard almost thought he saw a flicker of guilt. But it was gone in an instant. "I want my money back, Lisa," Richard said coldly. His tone was ice, his eyes burning with anger. Lisa tried to step back, but Richard blocked the doorway. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. You should be in a hospital, recovering, not causing trouble. Richard's heart raced. You stole everything from me. My properties. My money. My life. Lisa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She glanced behind her, where Jason had appeared in the hallway. Jason, tall and lean, had a confident grin on his face, but it faltered the moment he saw Richard. Richard, this isn't what you think, Lisa said, trying to act calm. We were just… You're a liar, Richard cut her off, stepping forward. You betrayed me, Lisa. You betrayed everything I ever believed in. Jason stepped in between them, trying to act tough. You need to leave, man. This is none of your business. Richard's voice was low, but filled with authority. This is my business, Jason. You and Lisa are going down for what you've done. He stepped aside and signaled to Marcus, who handed over a folder filled with the evidence: fraudulent property sales, forged signatures, bank transfers, and photos of Lisa and Jason living it up with his stolen money. Lisa's face went pale as she saw the documents. Her eyes darted nervously between Richard and Marcus. You can't do this, she said, her voice shaking now. I had nothing to do with it. I was just… No, Richard said, shaking his head. You weren't just anything, Lisa. You were a thief, a liar, and a traitor. At that moment, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a message from his lawyer. The FBI is on their way. We have enough to press charges. You've won. Richard smiled coldly and turned to Lisa. Your time's up. Less than an hour later, the Miami police and FBI stormed the penthouse. Lisa and Jason were arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. The officers cuffed them, and as they were led away, Lisa turned to Richard. Please, Richard, she begged, her voice desperate now. Don't do this. You don't understand. I understand more than you think, Richard said quietly, his face expressionless. As Lisa and Jason were driven away in separate police cars, Richard felt a strange sense of closure. The anger, the betrayal, it all seemed to melt away, leaving only a quiet satisfaction. He had faced the worst kind of deceit and had come out stronger. Marcus clapped him on the back. You did it, Rich. You got your justice. Richard nodded. But there was no joy in his victory. It was over. Lisa had taken everything, but in the end, she had lost it all. Richard turned to Marcus, his gaze hardening. Now I can move on. This is just the beginning. It's time to rebuild. As the sun set over Miami, Richard felt a new chapter begin, a chapter where he would no longer let the past define him, where he would rebuild and rise higher than before. But most importantly, he had learned that success meant nothing without trust. And this time, he would build his future on that foundation. As the sun set over Miami, Richard stood still, watching the horizon. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to lift from his shoulders, leaving him with a sense of finality. Lisa and Jason were behind bars, but it wasn't just the justice that mattered to him now. There was one thing left to do. Marcus, Richard said, turning to his best friend. We need to go back. There's someone waiting for me. The next day, Richard boarded a flight back to South Africa. He had left a promise unfulfilled years ago, the promise to bring his sister, Thandi, to America. While he had achieved unimaginable success, he had never forgotten the girl who had been his anchor when their father passed. When Richard arrived in South Africa, he went straight to the small village where he and Thandi had grown up. The village was the same as he had left it: dusty roads, humble homes, and the echoes of old memories. But now he wasn't the same Richard. He found Thandi at the local market, selling produce. She hadn't changed much. Her face was older, but the spark in her eyes was the same as it had been when they were children. Thandi, Richard called out, his voice breaking slightly. She looked up, startled, and then her eyes widened as recognition hit. Richards? She ran to him, tears streaming down her face. I thought you were gone. I thought I would never see you again. Richard smiled, holding her tightly. I promised you, didn't I? I promised that one day I would come back for you. He pulled back and wiped away her tears. Well, here I am. And I'm keeping that promise. A few weeks later, Thandi arrived in America with Richard. He had made good on his word, bringing her into a new world, a world of opportunity, luxury, and stability. But more than that, it was a world where the bond between them was unbreakable. As they stood together on the balcony of Richard's penthouse in Los Angeles, overlooking the city, Richard turned to her and said, "Thandi, I know the struggle we went through. I know what it was like to feel like there was no way out. But I've come to realize something. Success doesn't mean anything unless you have people to share it with." Thandi smiled, her heart full. "You kept your promise, Richard. I knew you would." "I didn't just promise to bring you here," Richard said, his voice soft but firm. "I promised I would give you the life you deserved. And that's exactly what I'm going to do." With the weight of betrayal behind him, Richard knew that this was the beginning of something much more meaningful. He had come from nothing, built an empire, and faced the deepest betrayal of his life. But in the end, he had fulfilled the most important promise he had ever made, to give Thandi a better life. And that was all that truly mattered. That brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoy what I do, kindly like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more videos. Thanks for watching.